The concern is that vaccine makers have insisted on keeping commercial deals around the world secret, which makes it hard to determine what a fair price is and who has paid what for those jabs. South Africa has administered more than 30 million vaccine doses, and at least 10 billion rand was allocated to buy vaccines last year. To discuss, we're joined by the founder and director of the Health Justice Initiative, that's Fatima Hassan. Ms. Hassan, thank you for being with us. It is believed, I think it's always been believed, South Africa paid more than some of the rich countries in the Northern Hemisphere for vaccines. There was even a justification put forward for that, in that they were involved in research and development and paid to help develop the vaccines. But we know there's inequity. Is that what sparked your interest here?
I think what we're concerned about is that, we live in a country which is regarded as a constitutional democracy. And we've had many agreements signed by our government which are subject to non-disclosure agreements and total secrecy and confidentiality. So you're right, pricing is one of the issues that we do not know enough about. And given that we've already allocated about 10 billion rand in vaccines, we'd like to know how much we've paid for vaccines, particularly for Johnson & Johnson, Pfizer, and also for the vaccines that came from COVAX. We'd also like to establish, whether we've signed agreements or contracts with any other entities or licensees or organizations that are in charge of actually administering or procuring vaccines for South Africa. And then there are other clauses that we are quite concerned about that have actually made their way into contracts in other parts of the world. Issues related to indemnification, issues related to export restrictions that undermine the sovereignty of a domestic government, issues related to breach of the contract where deliveries are not made timelessly or at all, and also issues around whether, if you have access vaccines in a country, which South Africa is potentially sitting with additional vaccines that they've ordered, then we need to know what are the provisions for not taking delivery of them or selling them onwards or donating them to a third country. So there's multiple issues that are at play. And unfortunately, what we've seen, not just in South Africa, but elsewhere in the world, is a lot of secrecy and very little transparency on the part of pharmaceutical companies. And as a result, governments having to agree to these very confidential secret agreements. I think the most egregious thing that we've encountered in the last few months is that we asked who signed these contracts, who are the contracting parties, and even that we've been told is a secret and is highly confidential. And, for us, that's just not a tenable situation. When we have a constitution that makes it very clear that our public administration has to act in a very transparent and in a very open manner.
There is a legal framework, though, here and in other parts of the world that respects non-disclosure agreements. Those can be signed. Do you have any hope that the courts here can compel government to open up those contracts?
So we hope so. I mean, we obviously believe that South Africa should not have signed the non-disclosure agreement. They may have been forced into a corner, but certainly they gave up a lot of autonomy when they did that. And we're hoping that the courts will basically say both to government as well as to the companies that they've signed these agreements with, that there's actually no basis in our law to insist on such high levels of secrecy and confidentiality in a pandemic. The precedent that we're setting here is quite dangerous. If we allow this in this particular pandemic for the first acquisition of vaccines, then we're going to have a situation of total non-transparency going forward, especially given, the report of the SIU into the corruption and issues of diversion of resources in the procurement of PPE. We are gravely concerned that that should not be replicated in the situation of vaccine contracts. There's also the issue of COVAX and, the agreement that has been signed with multilateral initiatives around what happens to the balance of supplies, what happens to the down payment that the South African government made. So there's very little transparency on a number of issues and elements, and we hope that we'll be able to convince our courts that there's a public interest and a constitutional need for the contracts to be made public.
Well, you mentioned some of the global contracts. Are there any global precedents here where governments or the pharma companies have been forced to disclose what was agreed upon? Because there must also be a concern, tell me if you agree, that no one will want to contract with South Africa. We do want to maintain those relationships, I guess.
Yeah, we want to maintain those relationships, but we want to do that in a way that is constitutional and that actually complies with the laws in South Africa related to procurement and to transparency, especially where we're using public resources, because you and I are actually paying for these vaccines. The precedent in other parts of the world certainly exists because there is a push towards more open government, more open transparency, particularly in procurement where you use state resources. A court in Colombia has ordered their government to actually open the contracts, and there are activist groups that are filing access to information requests around the world to get copies of the contracts. In some parts of the world, redacted versions have been made available, and in other parts of the world, activists are still trying to obtain the full copies of the contracts. So we certainly wouldn't be the only group in the world trying to access these contracts, but I think we certainly would be the only one trying to rely on the provisions of our constitution in South Africa to try and set a precedent for what is a permissible level of confidentiality or secrecy. And in a pandemic, in this case, the HII has argued in our papers that there's absolutely no grounds for secrecy and confidentiality to apply.
What about the global push? There was some outrage because the world has watched. We know that Pfizer and J&J have made profits. They did take risks in the beginning to develop these vaccines and they put down money. But if there is profiteering of poor countries rather than rich countries, if there's huge inequalities, what can be done to kind of enforce some sort of moral obligation to come up with standard pricing, to be transparent, at least on behalf of the pharmaceutical companies?
So I think you're right. In the absence of global pricing transparency in this pandemic, and in the absence of supply transparency, the visibility on supply schedules, then it's very difficult to hold anybody to account. So, you can't enforce accountability mechanisms in the absence of transparency because we wouldn't know what we're holding anybody to account to. Even the levels of the volumes of the contracts that the South African government has signed changes from quarter to quarter, and we've been tracking them and trying to hold on to them. But the issue about risk, I think, is an interesting one. What we've had with COVID is a situation where these companies, yes, you're right, have made billions, but they've also made billions of considerable public investment. So this wasn't just exclusively the investment into accelerated vaccine research. Reports after reports have shown the substantial amount of public investment and funding that has gone into the vaccine research and actually bringing the vaccines onto market. And that is why groups around the world are so interested in what is the price, what are the terms and conditions, and also how do you have a situation where a pharmaceutical company that is unelected, that exercises no, real office of authority in South Africa gets to dictate whether the terms and conditions of the contract can be disclosed, whether the contracting parties' details can be disclosed. You simply can't operate a system of health procurement with this much, secrecy.
All right, thank you very much, and we'll follow the court proceedings. Let's see what our courts say about opening those contracts, if government will be compelled to or not. That was the founder and director of the Health Justice Initiative, Fatima Hassan.